Hi, my name is Suzanne Charles, and I am a partner and co-founder at Root of Two, a design practice and research studio. We operate out of the lands of three Anishinaabe nations of the Council of Three Fires, the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi, and I'm calling in today from the Santa Ana Pueblo in New Mexico. And I'm grateful for the land and the people that have stewarded it over multiple generations. I'm an African American female with medium length, naturally curly, salt and pepper black hair. I'm wearing a black top, and behind me in the background, you can see beige curtains and a gray chair and a lamp. And I am really happy to be kicking off our conversation today around mapping creative vitality. We have some phenomenal co-panelists, presenters, facilitators, each in their own right, who have led the charge around really thinking about what does it mean to do sort of equitable and inclusive impact evaluation, research, data collection, and how we sort of engender new approaches to this work that sort of really honors the sort of people that we're working with and collecting data and telling stories through and about. So I'm really happy to be joining you today for this conversation and sort of acting as a kind of facilitator for the conversation, but I really want to invite them all now to kick off with introducing themselves. So I'm going to turn it over to Sunil to get us started, and then they all know how they're going to introduce themselves from there.
Thank you very much, Cezanne. Sunil Iyengar, Director of the Office of Research and Analysis at the National Endowment for the Arts. I'm speaking to you today from the lands of the Piscataway, Lumbee, and Cherokee peoples. And I'm wearing brown glasses and have behind me three windows, and I'm wearing a brown sports jacket. And I go by he, his, or him. It's great to be here. I just want to quickly note that I give my thanks to West staff and of course Cezanne for moderating as we look at expanding the frame for a discussion of the creative economy. And we can talk more about what that means. I know we will. Zani, are you next?
I think I am next. Hi, I'm Zani Voss. I'm a director of SMU Data Arts and a professor of arts management at the Meadow School of the Arts and Cox School of Business at SMU. I'm speaking from the ancestral home of many indigenous peoples on what is now Dallas, including the Caddo, the Wichita, the Tawakuni, and the Kickapoo, as well as the tribes of many that have lived and roamed the area, including the Comanche, Kiowa, and Apache, and those indigenous peoples whose names we don't know any longer. We honor, we revere, and respect those who are stewards of this land. I am a female of mixed heritage. I am African, European, Arab, Indian. And I am in a room that has a white background, a white wall, a white sofa with a couple of objects. I've got dark curly hair and dark eyes, and I am wearing a light colored sleeveless shirt. And thank you, Suzanne and West staff. Looking forward to the conversation.
Hi, everyone. Hello, fellow panelists. Very good to be with you. I'm Dee Schneidman. I use she, her, hers. I am the Senior Program Director for Research and Creative Economy at the New England Foundation for the Arts. I am coming to you from the lands of Massachusetts, Wampanoag, and Mi'kmaq people, among, as Annie said, many others who discovered for sure in the right way the land here and welcomed us to this part of the country. I have, visual description. I am in front of a white wall with some red framed art objects behind me. I am a white woman with blonde and gray curly hair, and I'm wearing glasses and a navy blue shirt. I think I'm especially excited about really moving this conversation in a new direction, really moving this conversation that I've been part of for some time at New England Foundation for the Arts, where we have really looked at how to understand our creative economy, our creative as a business sector, and kind of the impacts of that and what that means in developing new ways of defining, including who defines the kind of sector writ large, not just in economic terms. So that's what I'm really excited about.
Do you all want me to go next? Hi, everyone, and good afternoon. My name is Maitwan Win Akbar. I'm speaking with you from the traditional lands of the Coast Salish and Muckleshoot and other traditional peoples of the Pacific Northwest area, in Seattle particular. I go by she, her, and I am Impact and Assessment Manager at the Seattle Office of Arts and Culture, where I've been for the past 4 years. I started this work as a Mellon American Council of Learned Societies postdoctoral public fellowship position, and later on became permanent here at the city. It was part of an initiative to demonstrate the value of humanities and social sciences PhD in non-academic settings. I feel like it has been a really great opportunity and a great journey so far. In terms of my visual description, I am Vietnamese American, Asian American, with a short bob haircut and a coral colored shirt with a Space Needle poster from IKEA in the background. And I'm really glad to be with you all today. This is really great. A little bit more about my background is I did a lot of my education in Wisconsin, the Berkeley area, and Australia. So I'm really glad to bring a lot of the perspectives as a woman of color, trained as an ethnographer, but now doing mixed methods research here with you all today.
Hello, everyone. My name is Naima Khan, and I'm the owner and principal at my firm, Create Good Consulting, where I work on centering equity in evaluation as well as strategic planning. And I am speaking from the unceded and stolen territories of the Oceti, Sakowin, Wapekute, and Ojibwe nations and people. And I bring this up only to further the conversation on how we can think about perhaps giving them their land back, right? So this is beyond an acknowledgement and really thinking about the tools that we can use to normalize these conversations and take action, hopefully going forward. So by way of visual description and a description of myself, I am an American of Indian heritage. I'm wearing a beige golden hijab or scarf head covering, a dark red shirt, and have a couple of brown doors behind me, as well as a beige wall and a floral painting hanging to my left, as well as my green screen kind of leaning on the left wall. So I worked for 8 years in the field of philanthropy and have led internal program evaluation for philanthropic organizations, as well as equity work internally within foundations, and in a previous lifetime was a grant writer and public relations specialist at a women's shelter in Fort Bend County, Texas. Texas, my home of origin. And yeah, so I'm so excited to be here with everybody today, and thank you for joining us.
Great, thank you so much. So I feel like we should just really dive into the meat of this. Like when we were having a conversation getting ready for this, I think we all sort of affirmed the idea that like we understand that this work is not neutral, that the outcomes and the outputs themselves are not neutral, but also the inputs are often not neutral. So how do we sort of really think about what it means to try and approach this work with sort of inclusion, equity, and decolonial approaches in mind? And so I'll ask anyone who wants to dive into that very first sort of framing conversation, but I hope we just sort of continue to have dialogue around this.
I'm happy to jump in if that's okay. I don't need to go first in all the circumstances, but I really, again, the part of the reason I sort of welcomed this, and I know everybody here is really excited about talking about this having this topic discussed today, is, you know, just for so many years, and I'm speaking here now as the research director of the National Endowment for the Arts, you know, the studies we've done, for example, have largely relied on federal data collections. And I'm talking here about creative economy work or arts and cultural production. Our kind of, a few years ago, several years ago now, we signed an agreement with the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the Department of Commerce, to start tracking arts and cultural industries and workers according to their methodology for reporting the GDP. So they do that they report on the GDP every quarter, but every year we are now able to report based on a select kind of basket of industries and workers to look at what is the total contributions to the economy that arise from arts and cultural production. Now that taxonomy is not going to be the same that various states sometimes use for their own creative economy measurement or localities. Part of the discussion this morning was about, I think, how there is more need for standardization in those terms and terminologies. But nevertheless, it is one thing all these kinds of systems have in common is they rely on, as you said, data that has been, where the architecture for the data are really well in place before the research questions start to be asked about the creative economy. So we're relying on data collections that are used to report employment and to report revenue from various businesses. And some of those survey questions that were used to inform what we do now, were certainly not looked at from the lens we're discussing today. And specifically, more a broader kind of a view of not just understand, and the research questions have not moved beyond yet in some places, beyond asking what is the sheer impact as, maybe in terms of value added from GDP or number of jobs and those kinds of outputs, economic outputs, have not moved beyond that into understanding more about the beneficiaries and who's really benefiting from the creative economy and under what optimal circumstances. And so the more we think about this, and I'm not picking, it's not the BEA work that we do. We're really thrilled about doing that partnership. It's just more that, I'd like to see, and we're trying to welcome now through our research grants guidelines, more studies about some of the ethnographic components of the creative economy to be understood more wholly. And we'll get into this, I'm sure, but, looking at, data collections that are maybe developed by a community or that can be used to reflect attributes that we are not picking up through these large federal data sets. And this goes not only for creative economy, it has to do with arts participation, who's participating in what we call the arts, right? How many artists or creative workers are there? These are very expansive questions. And so the only way we can, I think, get closer to understanding the answers is by trying to collect richer qualitative data, as well as what we've talked about, community-based participatory research studies to catalyze those kinds of studies. And so we are hoping to do that, and we can talk more about this if you'd like later, but through our new research agenda to promote those types of studies alongside some of the work we're already doing around monetary impact, as from the national data sets, but also from the other studies we do around experimental, quasi-experimental research to understand causal inferences of not only the economy, but various aspects of the arts and outcomes and impact. I think those studies, as we all know, as researchers, tend to be hemmed in from this conversation in a way that we would like to open up. So, yeah.
It's super helpful, and I think it's a natural jumping off point to maybe talk a little bit about the sort of qualitative and the richness and rigor around qualitative research, because that's often really misunderstood or sort of put down to being sort of anecdotal. So for those of us engaged in sort of qualitative research, maybe you can sort of pick up on that and talk a little bit about that.
Well, maybe what I can offer is a transition kind of between the two, because when I think about, a topic had come up, what's the story, what's not being told by the statistics. I think sometimes the statistics can provide kind of a skeleton of findings, whether it's a description of a phenomenon. We found that, the majority of BIPOC organizations are more liquid than their non-BIPOC peers. Or relationships, looking at how large Eurocentric organizations that have a big subscriber base tend to have less diverse audiences. or perceptions, understanding that BIPOC employees and LGBT employees have a much stronger sense of need for psychological safety and well-being in a workplace, given the historically marginalized position that they've had. So looking at how sometimes there are statistics that can really dispel myths, tell interesting stories, but that's really just sort of the skeleton of it. That the real stories, the qualitative part, the reflections of people with the lived experiences on the ground really animate or kind of put flesh on the skeleton of those findings. So helping to understand, well, why are the majority of BIPOC organizations more liquid than their non-BIPOC peers? It takes getting out and talking with people to understand really what's happening. And, what are some of the tensions that are underlying that? Is it because of lack of access to capital and to funding that makes it so that either you're self-reliant or you don't have access to funds? What happens when you're really undercapitalized in terms of organizational capacity and human resources? That's where things get really interesting. So I think when we think about, I like to think of it as a both and, that certainly quantitative measures, they can shed light on a story, on a phenomenon, but it really takes getting out and talking to people and hearing firsthand how is this lived within their communities, within their organizations, before you really understand the complexity. And when we only look at quantitative and don't add the qualitative, oftentimes what we're getting is an incomplete story.
I can add to that. My two colleagues here already have really added a lot of shape to the kinds of themes I wanted to touch upon. But context really matters, right? We know that the interpretation of the same set of information from a survey can be interpreted in widely different ways by two different researchers with similar skill sets, but it's about the framework in which we interpret the quantitative and the qualitative research, actually, and our understanding of history and the way structure and agency intersect, and bringing that racial justice lens also to the kind of quantitative information that we're being deluged with actually on a regular basis. So I want to add some perspective. I've been involved in a number of creative economy studies and impact due to COVID studies in the arts and culture sector. And when we look at the numbers returning based on survey results, survey fatigue is real, right? So that's one already way to look at the data. Oh, we don't really have enough respondents from this particular XYZ communities responding to the survey. Why might that be? It might be because we're doing email outreach for the most part for people to respond to surveys. And who is missing from that picture oftentimes in survey outreach? So you all understand that dynamic already. Survey fatigue is real. That additional outreach is so important. And to have that robust outreach, you actually need the deep community engagement and the community relationships and partnerships with other nonprofit organizations, community-based organizations, to reach the communities most impacted by structural racism, and especially during the pandemic. So I'll reemphasize context is really important. I'm a mixed methods person, obviously very much steeped in the ethnographic research world, critical race, feminist theory, so on and so forth from grad school. But I don't shy away from the numbers, because we really do need the numbers to tell that impact story, especially for traditional funders, right? But obviously we're in a very interesting time period now where I think the conversation about equitable evaluation is making a lot of inroads, because I'm seeing a lot more references than I previously have in my understanding of where the conversation is now in that research and evaluation world. So in addition to the context, it's how you share back the research that also matters. How do we reimagine the traditional report genre to something else? Maybe there is a short video clip that tells that story from a community person's voice and perspective. I'll share a really great example that is not mine, but I want to amplify the example of this. Here at the City of Seattle, we have some really brilliant people who joined together from Department of Neighborhoods, Office for Planning and Community Development, Office for Civil Rights, with the input from artists and the Arts Agency to share back the preliminary findings of the decennial census. It was called the I Love Census work. I really loved it. They hired graphic recorder Stacy Wing from the community here to sort of visually represent where are the communities increasing, decreasing, displacement, what are some of the issues at play in how the census was collected, analyzed. So beautiful. I'm sure we could Google and find the URL, but I'm also happy to share it back with whoever needs access to that. So those are some things. I want to make space for others, but there's so many brilliant ways that I've seen community members and agencies share back the research and to reframe the narrative about impact. And also not tell that deficit story about communities of color necessarily. There's a lot of resilience and brilliance in our BIPOC arts communities. So let them also be at the table to tell their stories.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point. And I know it's something that we've really talked about is like, how do we sort of open up research to sort of be sense making and meaning making with communities rather than for and about them. And I think that sort of moving design research or research into that sort of space of participation is really interesting. And I know it's something that Dee's been working on, and I know that we had this conversation before with Naima too. So I'd welcome sort of you all getting involved in the conversation too.
Thank you. Yeah. So for me, and thank you, Dee. The key question is one of design, in my opinion, when you're talking about mapping or measuring creative vitality, thinking about who is involved on the front end in defining the terms on which, right, the terms through which we're measuring. And I think that those are such important questions just in terms of defining, right? What does success look like? What does success mean? I think so often, and particularly coming from the field of philanthropy, we tend to have these very, we tend to impose our own frameworks of what success looks like onto communities. And I feel like that is just the beginning of where the breakdown happens, right? And you have this ultimately unbridgeable kind of chasm form between institutions that are gatekeepers essentially and hold the power and the resources, and communities who don't have the ability to ever measure up to the bar quite, right? Because they're not setting it. There's no terms that they are setting, right? They're not even partners in the conversation. And that is a highly problematic trend and just structural reality, particularly in the field of philanthropy. And I want to say kind of more broadly speaking, nonprofit industrial complex, if I'm allowed to use the term here. But yes, I mean, I would say that is really where we need to ask the questions: who's on the planning in the front end of the design of evaluation, right? On the front end of whatever measurement method we're thinking of using, how are they contributing to the conversation? What agency are they bringing to the table? Those, I think, are some of the core questions that we really need to be asking. And in terms of, really great session, the grassroots power building with Noni Session from EB Prec, and how, she talks about, she had this really great quote, and it's not coming to me in the moment, but it's essentially pointing at the ownership of a community basically implies the power that they have in the conversation, right? And so how do we get communities to really own their own data? And a really great example of this, at least in my region, comes from the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa. The Tribal Nations Research Group is a nonprofit, shares geography of North Dakota. And the Tribal Nation Research Group has a data center whose purpose it is to develop a strategy process to review, govern, and maintain all of the research of their community, right? And so that to me is a really great and powerful example of how the Turtle Mountain community is really owning and setting their own terms in terms of how their data is collected, how their evaluation is used, right? When I was at their annual data conference a few years ago, they had a really great example of how they used community health indicators to collect data on elders as well as other, vulnerable populations kind of within their community, and really understand kind of the health disparities and health challenges that the community was facing. And it was just such great research, and it was completely owned and on the terms of the community. And so it was valuable to them. They were the ones that were saying, these are the metrics that are valuable to us and that we're interested in diving deeper with. So I'll stop there. I have a couple more examples that I'll share hopefully over the course of the conversation.
Naima, do you mind repeating again where the center was? Which?
Yes, so this is the Tribal Nations Research Group is located in, that shares geography with the state of North Dakota, and it's the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa.
Great.
That's an amazing example. And I want to add to what you just said, Naima, because I really agree about kind of the initial design and the setup and the instruments. And I think because in New England we started assessing economic impact such a long time ago, like in the 70s, we used, of course, existing systems so as to feel valid, right? To make the quantitative data valid and representative. And I think it's so insufficient, and it, really, if those systems are not kind of shared or exposed or designed in collaboration with whoever is being assessed, then it's almost like the researchers don't necessarily see where the gaps are and know where to complement with qualitative data or with new instruments. And so I think I'm bringing this up because I'm very deep in a coding project right now, because in New England, I oversee our basically public database and directory for the creative economy of the 6 New England states called creativeground.org. It's free, it's online, it's visible to everyone. And that's kind of how we complement, in a lot of ways, the very rigid systems of like industry codes in this country. And it's a creative tension where we basically are asking people to create profiles for themselves and give us feedback on the categories, right? So that we can then code them kind of on the back end and do research that is aligned and consistent with sort of federal systems, like Sunil was saying. And without that feedback from the communities and challenging us and saying, I don't see myself in these lists, I don't know that I would have really understood the tremendous gaps that there were, right? I mean, we know that the gaps for individual artists, people don't get counted for more than one job, all these things, right? That where the current systems don't fit our evolving economy. But even just in the very nitty-gritty way of the types of organizations that we're, collecting information, the types of artists, what they do, who their partners are, how they represent themselves. And I think this notion of the quantitative and the qualitative, the mixed methods really being very complementary is so key. But it even goes back to seeing the gaps in the quantitative data, because I get worried about those statistics that we then build around and put flesh on, because there's no way for those to be representative. They're just not. So, oops, sorry. It's almost like the more I learn from kind of exposing those data codes and being willing to look at what's really missing and insufficient, that to me is the starting place for like being able to improve the whole system. And I just love what you said about the collection and then sharing back and, having it be really a community process. But unfortunately, we tend to then come back down to defaulting to like, what's the kind of federal system? Because we have to compare. And, I think we have to be feeding that information back. That's why the partnership that you have, Sunil, with the BEA is so exciting, because it's only creating more connection to expand that system. I don't think we should continue to be limited by it, but it does, I think, have a really big impact on who ends up, who is assessed in those stats, that we can only do so much to kind of fill in, if that makes sense. So.
Yeah. I think it's also a really good jumping off point for this conversation, where we're sort of talking about the mixed methods nature of like going forward, but also to kind of grapple with the idea of the applied nature of a lot of this work. Like even the best descriptive statistics can sort of reveal what median incomes are compared to other professions and things like that. And I'm currently working on a research project now, as many of you know, that is sort of grappling with the statistical portrait of artists and the art and the American Community Survey work. But I'm really mindful of the idea that you can take that data quite literally and run with it and build new programs, new policies, new approaches. So if you find that the median income gap for artists or creative workers is so below standard or so close to the poverty ratio, then how are you building equitable kind of programs and approaches that sort of mitigate that, right? And so maybe we can kind of get into this conversation of maybe just even the changes that we face in our field because of the applied nature of a lot of what we're trying to do. Like we're trying to do this research to do something with it, right? To make a sort of positive, equitable, hopefully change to things. So maybe we can talk a little bit about that.
Well, sure. That I do both academic research as well as applied research, and I've always felt like when you have data from individuals, from organization leaders, that there's a responsibility, no matter what you learn, it should come back to them. I think sometimes it takes work. It isn't always evident how some of this isn't for myself, it's more for colleagues with whom I work who have a really strong sense of methodological sophistication and rigor. And when you find something, how do you bring it into a space where people say, now I know what to do with that information. I can understand, I can see what kind of inequities there were, what kinds of changes. Like how can this is about, mapping creative vitality, even through just literal mapping exercises, help to understand where there are communities that have underinvested in certain parts of the community, whether it's public agencies or private funders, looking for where those opportunities are, but also looking at kind of at loftier issues and trying to think, well, this is great, we've learned something and it's really profound. For us, we think it's groundbreaking from a theoretical standpoint, but for it to have use, how do you make the findings useful? And I can't say that we're always 100% successful in doing that. It's a kind of constant struggle of trying to really deeply engage people with the findings so that they're having their own aha moments with them in ways that perhaps we don't necessarily always anticipate.
Zani, I think you've done a really good job of that in the work I've seen come from you and your center. I think that, one thing I was thinking of, it's not exactly creative economy, but a project that I always think about when we talk about the theme of today, the decolonizing research and evaluation. A project I think about is one that we just got wrapped up, I think earlier this year, and it led to a report called We Making, WE-Making, and it was a report that was commissioned by several funders. The Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, we supported it, Kresge Foundation, and the Knight Foundation at an earlier stage, and the Bush Foundation, and I hope I haven't left out. Oh, and Art Place America. It's a lot of group, a lot of folks. And initially the goal had been to do a kind of scan of research about the arts and social cohesion, and particularly as it contributes to maybe health equity. And so there was a lot of work on that. And, I kind of naively went into it thinking, oh, this will be pretty standard, pull all the literature that's been done, look at all the numbers of studies, determine what the quality of evidence was, report out whether there is a strong link between the arts and this construct called social cohesion, which had already been developed. And I was gladly, I was shown that I was wrong in that as we got into it, because of the collective wisdom, I think, of these funders, but also the researchers who are doing this work, a great team, Metris Arts and PolicyLink, we were steered into the direction of actually making this a much more rich, textural report, really based on case studies. And yes, it did have its, it wasn't perfunctory, it had evidence review and everything, but it did, in fact, complicate the question. And what rose out of this was a tremendous amount of really great anecdotage, but also, supported by, different ways of knowing, different kinds of narratives that had surfaced that we wouldn't see in a standard, say, government report about the arts and social cohesion. And I think it was made the better for that. It had artists' voices clearly throughout the report. And there was a conceptual model that came from that qualitative work, and that points the way toward better quantitative data collection, I think. But I say all that because to me, that was like a real learning experience, and one that now with, in our case at a federal level, with President Biden signing the executive order on equity, and the so-called underserved populations and improving government service to those populations, there's a lot more reflection I can vouch for going on, not only at the NEA but a lot of our other sister agencies, about how we tackle everything from research to policy to practice. And I think for the better, and I think it's coming, for me, it's almost a shift from, for so long we had our eye on the ball of, let's demonstrate let's understand why and how the arts matter, And so we do all these studies about economics, behavioral research, showing there's some measurable impacts of the arts under various conditions. But of course, not, I think, doing as much work, as I've said, in kind of for whom and under what value propositions, like who is developing that value proposition, and are they part of the studies? And I think as we move beyond sheerly measuring impact to using research in a more applied way, as has been discussed, to solve questions about equity and service, I think we can improve hopefully our track record even on the research side. Stun you all into silence.
I was just thinking about Eduardo Diaz with the Smithsonian Latino Institute, that talks all the time about nothing about us without us. And the conversation keeps reminding me of that, in that it's not to say it can only be us, but if you're going to allow a phenomenon to be explored, then you have to include us as part of the initial.
It's going to make for better research too. It's just going to, that's the goal. You're going to get more meaningful and relevant research if truly those voices are integrated from the top to bottom. And it's an ideal, but one can accomplish it in very discrete ways, such as examples you all have given so far.
Yeah, I think one of the things that is interesting about all of this work is the way that it sort of challenges and troubles the notion of expertise and who actually does get to sort of really be involved in making meaning, discovering what the outcomes and the outputs should be, and kind of it does reframe and often reposition the role of researcher, right? And so I wonder, how are we sort of thinking about training people to sort of embrace this? Do we need a new way of thinking about how do we come to these practices as researchers? And if there are examples that either any of you have other than humility, with lots and lots and lots of humility, like how do you think about entering space now as a researcher that's trying to sort of move to this space of, nothing about us without us, or sort of, shared or participatory approaches towards doing this work?
I'll jump in. I learned a lot from being in a collaboratory with the Equitable Evaluation Initiative that was hosted in Massachusetts by the Bar Foundation. And, it really goes back to me. I learned so many things, but really being willing to look at what the orthodoxies are that you're operating under already in order to, really ask the hard questions, include the biggest naysayers in the conversation, right? You have to me, it's a really important step to kind of start from where you are and take the ego out of it and just acknowledge all of the harm that's been done, frankly, and what we don't want to perpetuate and that it's, there's failing forward. But I think the more you can kind of include multiple perspectives when looking at those pre-existing orthodoxies or frameworks, I think that to me is really important in making something practical on the other end, and really looking at, well, yeah, who decides who does the asset mapping? Who decides what's an asset? Who is defining these things? And I think people are afraid that it might take more time and be hard, and it is, and it will. And it also, to Sunil's point, will make better research. And ultimately, you have to be able to answer the why am I collecting this? Why am I assessing this? Right? There has to be some reason. And if you want to be serving XYZ or engaging with or partnering with, which is very different from serving, starting really early with that. I will say that as someone in an organization who's both a grant maker and has kind of created a lot of, these sort of research frameworks, like I said, defining the creative economy, how we map it in New England, I do get a lot of questions from people. Well, do you have lists or do you have ways of identifying XYZ, right? Subsets of the creative economy. And I think there's a desire for kind of an easy answer, and it's certainly not that. It's defining what something means with those people you want to engage with. And when it comes to, it's not just like, oh, are you collecting demographic information? Can I sort this information in this way? You have to really think about who you're engaging with and what the outcomes are that you're seeking. Because again, so many blind spots, for researchers all over the place. But so I'll stop.
Thank you so much of what you're saying resonates with me. You can see me kind of nodding my head off here, but I think, really kind of understanding the troubled history of research, right? And the troubled trends all across sectors, right? Across government, across academia, nonprofits, philanthropy, right? Thinking about the troubled relationships that folks have created in setting up that researchy paradigm, right? The evaluand and the evaluator, and really kind of understanding and unpacking what that has done to communities in terms of agency and power. And I think those are really the important conversations to start with in any type of endeavor that seeks to redefine or reshape how research is done. Because again, you're not going to get any different results as long as you don't change the composition of people who are leading this work, right? And so whether that means changing the composition of the government bodies that run this, work or study, from an academic perspective, right? Really kind of understand it, even if you're undertaking like a scan of the field, right? Who's informing that? Right? Who's at the table actually understanding what are the key research questions that we're asking? And, again, going back to some of the fundamental design questions, I think is going to be such an important part and path moving forward. And I really appreciate the Equitable Evaluation Initiatives. On their resources page, they actually have several really great, kind of resources at the point to, and particularly the culturally responsive evaluation, or what we in the world of evaluation called CRE, right? Thinking about the really big figures and historical kind of authors in this space, Black authors, Stafford Hood, Rodney Hobson, right? These academics, these really big figures who have shaped evaluation for such a long time are really leading the conversation in those spaces. So how do we look to these conversations and resources that are already there? They point out the key characteristics of culturally relevant evaluation from the literature, right? And to me, I'm sitting here as a practitioner, a consultant, I sometimes sit in the thick of coding qualitative data myself, knowing that I'm coming from a certain lens as I'm coding that qualitative data, right? To me, this provides a really practical guide on saying, what are the considerations that I need to take into account, as I'm shaping and designing evaluations, right? So I go back and I look at the CRE guide and I say, am I asking myself these questions? Am I incorporating these considerations actively into my research design and shifting how I operate, right? As a result of that. So it's not just about kind of asking ourselves these questions in kind of a a vacuum and kind of sitting within four walls, and then reinforcing status quo, right? It's really about bringing in new voices and having the tough conversations and building the muscle to continue having those tough conversations. And Dee, like you said, pointed out so smartly, it is going to take more time. It is going to take more resources, and squaring with the fact that if we're really invested in doing this kind of work, then we're going to make that effort.
I want to add a couple things that I think we've previously found to be could be improved, maybe more satisfying. We have a lot of data sets that here in the arts sector, arts and culture sector, that we do look to for some answers preliminarily. And when we don't find the answers in those data sets, we're often left to our own devices to try to reconstruct that data or look for some proxy variables to at least get us a temperature check of where the needs are, where the devastation is, especially during the pandemic. And I think there's also some reimagination that I'm seeing my peers do in the sector around just thinking, who is an artist and cultural worker right now? How do we redefine that? And not be limited to these industry NICS codes that we're all very familiar with. There are some significant limitations in that. I think the colleague who we might have just lost on to technology had called out that artists are not necessarily just defined by being an artist as a 9-to-5, right? Our artists are also hustling hard in other economic spaces as well. So their impact in the hospitality field, because of the need to go on lockdown, that's impacting their other forms of economic opportunity. And so to also lose your consultant gig position and lose your hospitality job, for instance, not to mention other consulting jobs, that's double loss of income during the pandemic. So to just think about who are the artists, how are they making a living, and to also now reimagine, because of the network economy, digital artists, YouTubers, vloggers, all the different types of creativity out there now that is not necessarily the traditional forms. And that just the only constant is change in our field and how it's evolving. So just being kind of open to that, having your ears to the ground, and connecting with, I don't want to sound ageist, but connect with a lot of the new emergent and young artists coming out with new bodies of work. And also, leading with race, and not just crafting brilliant reports that only speak to the economics, but also the, identity and the different intersections out there. We know the data sets are imperfect, so how can we improve them, improve the outreach in representation, but also reimagine other types of triangulation that we need for confidence in our investments and decision making.
Yeah, I think that brings to mind so many things, specifically around just even whether or not, like, within the sort of creative and cultural fields we're as set up as we think we are in terms of digital inclusion for sort of arts and cultural workers and creative workers, and sort of, there are data sets that would help us to tell that story. And the American Community Survey itself is used by a lot of digital inclusion advocates to sort of look at sort of the sort of real place-based connected role to sort of access to technology that folks are facing. But I also think what that brings to mind is this idea of, like, how are we sort of using sort of data and research to bridge these kind of gaps between the way we sort of inherited an economy that is based on full-time applied work as the gold standard, to really having to think about grappling with the sort of unpaid labor, unpaid sort of parts of the creative economy, as well as sort of really diving into sort of what the creative economy we want and deserve is. And those are justice issues, right? they're not just being able to rely on the economy as it is. So I wonder how you see research playing an active role in shaping that discussion around the creative economy we want and need rather than the one we have, perhaps. That's a really big question, but I want to go there if we can.
Cezanne, can I ask before we go there, you've had such amazing thoughts articulated on this idea of new creative economy. Could you just share a little bit more about your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think from my point of view, it's always really been the story of we have a base understanding of what the sort of economic models are in a sort of free market kind of capitalist system. And now we need to sort of look at how we sort of shift those paradigms to sort of actually encompass everything from the racial equity gaps that we see to the sort of gender gaps we see in both sort of economic justice kind of frameworks and lenses, to then also applying that to how we're sort of thinking about like the baseline extractive nature of like everything from technology and economy and those sorts of things. And so it begins to be this very critical lens on how does the creative economy do better? How does it point to what's next for, where we would want the sort of what other people would refer to as the real economy to lead? And I think there are examples within arts and cultural practices, maybe not that show up in data sets, that would lead us to sort of explore things like the solidarity and sharing economy, the way that we can sort of form more powerful sort of networks and look at network effects. And so the current kind of research that I'm doing is looking at the preconditions of place in 3 different cities around what helps Alana BIPOC artists sort of survive and thrive, and what might be the kind of policies and programs you would build to make that more robust and resilient. So like I end up wanting to be like, what's general operating support for artists, right? Like that's like my thing. Like how do we sort of actually have something that feels a lot more long-term and stable and resilient for sort of artists, so that maybe they're not always reliant on the gig. Because I don't know that if the choice was given, would you rely on the gig economy? I don't think that would be the answer.
Well, in fact, just to try to answer your question a little bit from my perspective, I do know that there's something called the Contingent Worker Survey, which is a survey of the gig economy, essentially the Bureau of Labor Statistics offered, and we've reported some of those results out for artists. And I'd have to go back and revisit the findings. I think there is a danger of assuming that everyone who's in it, has elected it. Just the question you had asked made me think about a couple of resources I would just offer. So when we started our, for several years now, actually, we just crossed our 10-year mark of giving out grants for research, and the guidelines are constantly evolving. But one of the things we did is we set up a program called the NEA Research Labs. And the real goal here was to understand that these are long-term questions that we're asking. They really do require commitments and multi-year commitments. So we set up the Research Labs program to allow competitive applicants to come in seeking to do a multi-year research agenda in a particular topic about the arts. And one of the things we did is we required partnerships including between researchers and non-researchers and researchers and arts practitioners or artists. And so that, trying to incentivize some of that sharing, I think we're contemplating doing more here with regard to community-based participatory research. So that's a practical application, but one of the things that resulted, 2 projects I can think of. One is the Rural Policy Research Institute did something called the Comprehensive Wealth Framework, or Comprehensive Rural Wealth Framework, which is a very different way of conceptualizing the creative economy, and really based more on sort of human capital as well as just your standard outputs and standard operating models for measuring the creative economy. And it's very theoretical in nature, but it does kind of really try to come up with a more holistic, integrative approach to thinking about the creative economy, because out of necessity, because rural economies are often, as was suggested, they may not be things that we brand immediately as creative economy elements, but they certainly fit into that framework when it's a little bit more robust. So that's something somebody can look at, or I can send a link to. But another thing is another research lab out of Indiana University. There's some great work going on there around, I think it's Doug Noonan and Joanna Veronkovich and a bunch of their students and others looking at artists in particular and scraping data off the web and looking at other ways of understanding arts employment and arts artist conditions. And so there's a little bit more work going on, and we can always broaden that pipeline and do more. But those are two things that I think may be worth maybe sharing or discussing at some point. And one last thing, when you mentioned digital inclusion, I brought to mind a report we did earlier this year on arts and technology, and it was intended as a field scan of artists and technologists really who don't sit comfortably in that space that many sort of taxonomies designate as part of the arts ecosystem, but in fact are, of course, a growing and vibrant part of that ecosystem. And so understanding, but it also applies some of the same questions we've been talking about around equity and inclusion to understand who's in that group. You can't say it was, it's not a scientific survey, but it is more of a field scan based on interviews and national roundtables, regional roundtables that were held around the country before COVID.
I think that that's important, this idea that there are field scan mapping and sort of ecosystem-based approaches, which are trying to sort of, at least in some way, shape, or form, like frame up the new terrains, new territories where kind of arts and creative economy are going. And that includes really looking at how it becomes very specific to sort of rural communities, because we know most of the data sets don't do a great job at sort of mapping smaller communities, or at least lending themselves to sort of smaller community research. But then also just this idea that like we're starting to have to grapple with what do we even mean by arts, and how that gets blown up to be a much broader thing when we think about kind of cultural traditions. So I want to make sure that we make some time to really dive in maybe to the sort of where are we going next with both the kind of research work, and then also kind of where's the creative economy going next in tandem with that. So anyone who wants to dive in? I think Zani, since you put me on the hot seat and I wasn't ready for
it. A little payback time. In terms of research, some of the research that excites me most now and that I admire most, begins with listening, with scheduling a lot of time, as Naima was saying, and indeed, it's more expensive, it's more time consuming, but it's so worth it to be able to not take the deficit-based approach, but really listen and lift up the incredibly relevant and powerful work that happens in organizations that are operating with, historically communities that didn't have their voices necessarily lifted up. It's not just about trying to shine a light on the areas that are challenges, but I think that there is so much to be learned about the compelling importance of the cultural traditions and community connections, and thinking about, to the earlier point, I think of research, it is a way of evaluation. It's not evaluating for someone else. It's simply evaluating a situation, of making sure that as you're listening and trying to see the through line across individuals, of going back to them to make sure that, did you hear accurately? Is the way you're capturing it accurately reflected of their mental model of how things happen? We had done some work with Wallace Foundation looking at alchemy of high-performing arts organizations in color this past year, and it just found the relationships and the ways that success happens in organizations everywhere, that same sense of brilliance. And I think that there is that traditional kind of Eurocentric lens that growth is good, and learning that small and mighty and powerful happens in every community. So not just thinking about, the financial and the operating metrics as an endpoint, as the outcome, but in fact, many times that's just the input. People need some resources in order to do the mission related work and to serve communities. So how do you think about even as you're listening and people are talking to you about the fact that, and at a point they needed resources. So how does that fit into the picture, not as the end goal, but as a necessary component of getting to what the real end goal is? That's what I find kind of interesting and exciting right now with research.
Where I used to work at the Bush Foundation, we funded a variety of different topics and issue areas. So the Community Innovation Grant particularly was the team I used to be on. And that is where we invested in a bunch, the foundation had invested at that time in a bunch of, different kind of projects that were really trying to center, collaborative and inclusive approaches to their work in creating transformation. And, part of what I observed after kind of the creative placemaking bubble, if you will, is really an expansion and almost explosion, I would say, in the maker space, kind of growing up, particularly in the rural, areas of our region, which is Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, and the 23 tribal nations that share that geography. And so, a lot around just maker spaces and how do communities become technically savvy, as well as develop the infrastructure and the supports that they need to, support independent artists and artist communities, such as bead workers, in Native communities and jewelry makers, et cetera, right? And thinking about how small towns, right, like really kind of contribute in this space and how they thrive as a means, through the means of creative economy. And what I found is that absolutely, I mean, speaking to Zani's kind of point about the assets-based framework and how each community has something unique to contribute, I think where funders struggle is when you're rolling all of that up, right? And how do you really kind of collect that impact story and tell it in a way that resonates. And I think, given that, I think it's not impossible. And again, it depends on the context in which you're shaping that storytelling expectation, right? If you're within a very like institutionalized, like highly, again, coming from funders setting the terms on, what's reported out and what counts as success, I think it's going to be a very difficult conversation to bridge. But the more you invite those communities in to actually set the terms, the more they're able to contribute and use their own language, use their own assets and wisdom and collective experience to actually shape, like, okay, how are we telling this story in a more broad way that helps us really shift the narrative around what contributes to a creative economy and keeps it going and what's needed to sustain it, right? Because so much of the time, institutions kind of tend to miss the capacity building and infrastructure building that is absolutely necessary, particularly in smaller community-led organizations and like rural regions, to really kind of sustain, right, and measure the way that we want data to show up, right? And again, those words, like how we want data to show up versus how do these communities want data to show up and what's meaningful to them, right? So I think the way forward has to involve some type of an investment and intentional spending time and figuring out how to deeply and meaningfully invest in those capacities.
I want to share some examples and just a quick time check. How are we doing? Because I know people are probably eager.
I believe we have about 10 minutes left before we open it up to Q&A.
Okay, sweet. So in 2019, I had the pleasure of working at the time with Randy Engstrom, who's your kind of co-producer of this Creative Economy Summit. And we took the time that year to do a number of studies and community listening sessions. And I had the opportunity to sit in on a lot of focus groups that we conducted and an aggregate of surveys. We did some collaborations with the UW, University of Washington Evans School of Policy. That was I'll just call it our summer of creative economy everything. And there are so many flaws that I think people here have already pointed to in terms of the donor funder hegemony nonprofit industrial complex that folks like the brilliant Brule write about in his blog, the Nonprofits AF blog, formerly Nonprofits with Balls. And we understand the dynamics of the shortcomings of funding our artists and creative economy through just applying for funding from large-scale funders. I'm really interested in the future of the creative economy and assessing how individual artists, independent artists, teams of artists are able to crowd fund and fundraise for their own livelihoods through Patreon, Kickstarter, Twitch, all of these different streaming platforms, for them to set the terms of their payment, right? Going directly to the, I guess, art audiences, art consumers, patrons, because we know that this nonprofit industrial complex is deeply flawed because of the history of colonial funding practices that many of you have named and that Edgar Villanueva has written about in Decolonizing. I can't remember the full title of the book, but I've got it on my shelf, I promise. And then in that 2019 set of listening sessions, we reached about 1,000 artists. We know what their needs are and how can we not over collect information, but now move into the space of addressing their real problems and struggles with obtaining health insurance, right? You need to know that your health is taken care of if you are gonna give back to the, contribute to society through arts and creative practice. Safety is a real issue for artists. Public safety, coming back late at night from their performances and so on and so forth. So there's so many needs that our artists have that have been addressed time and again in so many reports and focus groups, and also the historical racial inequities of who gets to be an arts administrator and a leader in any given large cultural institution. There are barriers, glass ceilings, and colorism, all of those different issues at play there. It forces us as a public sector, specifically at the municipal level, to reimagine what is that role of government in fostering an inclusive creative economy, and how do we do that without just being an echo chamber as well in the arts, in the arts sector. So it has to be very cross-sector as well. We cannot just come up with our own solutions on our own. There are a lot of smart and brilliant people, obviously, leading to try to address these issues, but we really have to be all hands on deck, cross-sector, and listen to the voices of communities of color.
I think that's so many great points. And I mean, of course, I worry about the way that the algorithms shape who gets seen on those platforms and who is able to monetize themselves on those platforms, and how do we sort of bust open the black box around technology, but also the black box of kind of the research that happens in terms of participation and sort of visibility, both as an artist in any of those contexts. And I think it's like always a question of how are we not sort of moving into these other spheres of practices with the same sort of inequitable practices attached to that work. And I think that that's like a brilliant sort of setup for probably our last couple minutes before we open it up to Q&A, which is what I'm going to ask each of you to sort of maybe say one thing that you would like to either challenge the field to do better or yourself to do better over the next year before we open it up to Q&A. And I'll start with myself. I think the thing that I most want to sort of bring into the world is a sort of sense of the researcher who is flexible researching with, and that's a real sort of challenge to my own sense of sort of autonomy and expertise and decision making. So I think decision making with communities at the forefront is something I'm interested to challenge myself to continue to do. Who would like to go next?
I was about to say something to respond to the other, and so this actually is, if you don't mind, I'm going to kind of customize it for your answer. One thing I've seen that, there's been a lot of promise, and we have to see the full results of this, but at the federal level is much more federal agencies doing work, and this has to do with what was said earlier about survey fatigue and combating that, to look at some of these sort of these data sets that are historical, that have been collected for years by the government, and linking them to administrative records that are at the local level or regional level. So, this may be like a local unemployment office, their findings, and linking that up with the demographic characteristics you can get from the Census Bureau or something like that. But there are many ways this can take shape, and particularly with the kind of organic data that's being talked about, whether it's a crowdfunding platform or what have you. I think there's a lot more opportunities for data agreements and for creating those kinds of connections. And again, we're still not beyond completely the crisis or the problem that was raised, the core original problem, which is not having necessarily communities bound up in the data collections. But we are getting there will be more context to then hold up and to give back to the community and to understand how those data sets relate to their on the ground view of some of these things. And I'm talking here about federal data that can be maybe linked with administrative records across different offices at different localities. The other thing I just quickly want to throw in there is, you heard me say about community-based participatory research, something I think we could do more with perhaps as a funder. But I think that, I look around, and even in this capacious field called the arts, there's some really interesting work going on that's sort of adjacent to us in the creative economy. So collective impact models in arts education. There's a lot of this same concept of shared measurement systems, bringing in community members to engage directly with the funder on what matters and how to track progress in this case, arts education, the provision of arts education. Even in the creative placemaking rubric under that heading, there's a lot of, as you know, work that was done really very, very early on when that term started being used widely, maybe a couple decades ago or so now. But when it started being used widely, right away there are kind of questions about the fuzziness, perhaps, of some of the metrics being used, and understanding the need to understand, for example, looking at the adverse effects of gentrification and being more cognizant of other values than purely community development kind of standard economic outputs. So I think there's some common cause here in these adjacent areas, which are not squarely within what we call the creative economy discourse, that I think can apply. And I think the more people that we can engage with collaterally across different sectors and even within the arts, I think the more likelihood the work is going to rise to the quality that can be a uniform pattern or template for everyone.
I'll jump in. I think about Abigail Echo Hawkes, talking about determining what is the information that they want us to gather in speaking about different communities. And so when I think about this coming year, I think about, our commitment is already squarely on research on issues of equity, inclusion, and belonging, to continue to try and do a better job of listening and lifting up, but also thinking about our role in equitable data collection. Part of what we do is collecting data in addition to conducting the research, and really thinking deeply about how to reimagine how, when, and what data is collected. It's not a small thing to change, but I think it's something that we are committed to changing and figuring out what that means in a way that's meaningful to the people whose data it is.
Piggybacking on that idea, did I interrupt you, my friend? Okay.
Naima, go ahead.
All right. So I, thinking about the broader advice that I would have for myself first and foremost, right, as well as just like organizations and institutions more broadly, is really seeking to understand the why that we approach the work with and our value sets that inform us going into it, right? And really holding that as kind of our primary intention and orientation as we move through the work. And so, you know, what I mean by that is really kind of spelling out a system of values that guides your work, and understanding how those values are operationalized is something that I've been trying to put into practice as in my own work independently, but also just really kind of encourage folks to think about, because I think that why really links back to what are the key measures that you're looking at ultimately, right? Like what baselines are you starting with, and how are you looking at data in a nuanced way, so that when you look back at those baselines and make comparisons, you get meaningful data that will actually help you with the storytelling, and, you know, really kind of going back and linking that all the way through. So going from that theoretical and, you know, what we tend to call kind of heady, you know, hearty space of, you know, values and things, and really kind of building out and drawing down, you know, how that practically impacts our practices.
Given I just spoke a ton really recently, I want to just add that I was really inspired when I heard John Powell speak at Grantmakers in the Arts in Oakland not too long ago about what research is and what communication and narrative are, and how we can make sure that these different actions are intertwined, because we know research does at face value isn't going to do the work in and of itself. We really need everything in that ecosystem work together to communicate with impact and to do narrative shift. And I thought that I think the thought just escaped me, but I was really I sometimes question myself because I am someone who got trained in all of the degrees. I've got a lot of degrees under my belt, and I sometimes want organizations who may not have, like, quote unquote professional researchers on staff to own their confidence in knowing what information they need, and not to undersell the information and data that they have just because they're not necessarily trained researchers. I think that some messy data is better than no data, and that we all have, you know, instincts about what is going on in our communities, and to not default to imposter syndrome when it comes to the research. I think research is not just something that is just done by the professional researchers. It can be done in partnership. Obviously, many of you already addressed community-based action research as a model that we can all aspire toward, and indigenous ways of evaluation exist out there too. I'm not the expert, but I know there's a lot of great indigenous researchers out there doing that work. I always have an open door policy with folks who want research advice from me on how to address a need out there with the resources you have, because we all don't have multi-million-dollar research budgets. And oftentimes the people with those multi-million-dollar research budgets are perpetuating colonial practices of RFPs. I'm not going to name any names here, but they're just do the work you need to do at the scale that you need to do it within, and share it back. And it research is so iterative in and of itself that it's not finished. It's not going to be perfect, but you know, I think leading with the values of what you want to attain, and sorry, I'm losing my articulateness. Limited sleep last night. Okay, I'm gonna kick it to Dee.
That could not have been a more perfect setup. So thank you, Maitawan. Because I think something I really think we're focused on at NEFA, New England Foundation for the Arts, is as a service organization and as an intermediary. You know, our commitment is really, so I'm gathering all this data and really trying to get better at gathering stories And we can talk to our funders, we can talk to our state arts agencies, government agencies, and gain confidence, like you were saying, in what we value, what we hear from the communities, actually connect our communities with the funders who are providing the funding that we're redistributing. So I really think that for all the service organizations out there at whatever level, there's a real opportunity to build some trust between communities and funders and really re-articulate what the values are and what is getting measured and how, and not just kind of default to the easy, very antiquated colonial systems that we all have. And, it's maybe human to do, but so I think that, there is a confidence building piece and a trust building piece that really resonates for me. So that's, I think, a commitment. Think about the role that you have and where you can be strategic. And I think that collaboration is really going to be necessary for any of this to move forward, because there's power dynamics to address. So I think we have to kind of start addressing them directly.
Yeah. So I believe we are now at the point where we're going to be joined by a WestF team member who's going to be fielding us some really lovely questions from those that assembled today with us to sort of dig into the meat of this conversation. So
you gave us some lovely questions too, Cezanne. Let it not be forgotten.
I will take that and say thank you. So I believe appearing on camera soon. Hello, Ashanti.
Hi, how are you? Okay. Wonderful. Okay, so it seems like we have a few questions. From Ted Russell, Cezanne and all, could you please talk about general operating support for artists and how to best study in its various forms, from GI, UBI to fellowships and whatever else you might have to include, and how to best, how to best study impacts when they are across so many dimensions, pertaining to individual physical and mental health, cultural production, housing, etc., and field. Field level implications. Okay.
So I'm happy to dive in here. I think, for one, a lot of these are sort of new models and new practices, so a lot of the research is really emergent alongside that. I will say for the project that we're currently working on, we're trying to really understand what we're thinking of as kind of 8 dimensions of sort of support that artists are asking for. The dimensions themselves were generated from interviews with artists. So within our research, we're doing sort of interviews and statistical portraits at the front end, which is how we learn, so that we can interspace to actually do more generative research in the second phase. And I think for us, it's really like, how do we think about beyond the scarcity model and beyond the fellowship model? How do we actually look at what is durable funding and financing and support for artists? And that's going to take a lot of different shapes. Some people are more comfortable with the UBI model, and there's some really inspiring models coming out around guaranteed income or universal basic income for artists. There's a couple pilots happening specifically. I know that there's one in Ireland that we've been kind of tracking. But I think for us, we're sort of like, how do you actually have an evidence-based gap for artist wealth, which is driving the conversation of what a fellowship or a fund should be and at what level, and can you do it over a couple of years rather than a one and done sort of investment in artists? So if it looks like you're sort of knowing that you're going to fund and support a cohort of artists over like 3 years or 5 years as a period, how does that change what else they're able to do in addition to it being flexible funding? So making sure that the research remains constant as we're actually piloting the programs is kind of where we're at with that work.
Thank you so much for that question. We have a question from Reese Tanamura. Are there any studies, research suggestions on adapting how other benefits like health insurance, retirement, childcare, typically supported with factory model full-time work that can be offered, supported, expanded to improve the livability of cultural gig work. Also cultural bearing or other cultural sustenance work that do not necessarily take financial compensation. Particularly Reese would like to imagine how municipal and nonprofits and or social impact businesses might use their infrastructure to help support this.
I want to say hi, Reese, our former art music commissioner here in Seattle. Really great question. And I really think we should write an NEA grant to answer your questions. Because they're really worthwhile addressing. And we've definitely had many conversations, even with Sunil in the room, about workforce issues and creative workers.
Yeah,
I'm sorry, my brain has shut off for the day. I'm done.
It's hard to answer that. That's a very good question. The thing that occurs to me, and I haven't checked in with them lately, is, you know, the Center for Cultural Innovation has been, I think, really doing some, you know, some pretty true to their name, innovative work around understanding sort of some of these factors, I think, that may come up more directly in their reportage and what they have a program. And I think you should probably look at their website and understand them a little bit. And maybe some of these, maybe some of what you're asking would be a great conversation with somebody there like Angie Kim, more than I can certainly offer on my end. But I think these are really, you know, thinking about compensation and the variety of forms of compensation, what that entails and how to monetize it and understand it better. Something I know she, not to put her on the spot, but I think they would be good at thinking about this.
Yeah, it also brings to mind some of the work that Springboard for the Arts was doing through Laura Zabel, looking at sort of the health gaps that artists have and experience in the way that they've built programs to help mitigate that. But I think that there is a bigger question about, like, what is the social safety net that actually would sustain an individual artist and creative worker that is being asked, and is there data from different areas that would support how to build that, how to resource that, how to ensure that. That would be fascinating. I would love to see it.
Yeah, I mean, that's what comes to my mind too. I'm like, is there any way to collect this data without having to do direct survey? Although that would be great. I mean, I'm just thinking about, you know, there's so many gaps in the ACS and the PUMS data and, you know, and all the kind of any sort of personal census data or individualized census data. And a number of years ago, we did a direct survey of the artists and creatives, individual creatives across New England, and it had to be so long because we had to ask about all these different areas that, you know, have been raised here, because the definition of livability is very different for other sectors than it is for ours, or even the factors, or, you know, what the revenue and sources are for folks within our sector. So I'd love to hear if there's an alternative way, or a shorter survey we could do.
But I am mindful that the American Community Survey does at least ask about health insurance, and I'm not sure what other questions they might have. But that, I mean, that and being able to look at that through a racialized lens or a racial justice lens to pick up on what's true when you dig into the demographics might be a good starting point, at least on health insurance.
Yeah, agreed. And we've looked at some of that, but not, I don't think we've broken they'll have to go back and look, but years ago, we haven't looked at the health insurance by race, ethnicity, for example, and those cross tabs. But those data are there, yeah.
And we had another question. I know that we're almost at time, but AFTA's Arts and Economic Prosperity Study number 6 will begin soon. Will you be involved with this even tangibly?
I'm not involved with it, but know about it.
Same here.
Same here.
I'm in a different region, but we work with our state arts agencies who participate to use the data because we have our region-wide database. So we're kind of looking that way.
Ditto, I'm in a different region and that's no involvement.
Okay. We have a question from Julia Brook. How do you see technology playing a role in the future of a more equitable and borderless way of working across cultures and disciplines?
That would be a lovely next session. I mean, I also have a creative practice that works at the intersection of design and technology. And I think like anything else, there's utopian and sort of more visionary liberatory visions of how technology can sort of be a more equitable space. But I would say that if you actually look at how and who produces the technology and who owns the data, the resources, the research of that, it also can be one of those spaces where we still have to consider questions of safety, of equity, of surveillance capitalism, and how that all shapes what we think of as technology as a real sort of space for artists to inhabit. So I think we always will be carrying those kind of inclusion and equity questions into these new spaces. And we have to ask the same questions about governance in those spaces as we ask about governance in sort of in real life, right? So that's what I think. I work in technology quite a lot and I love it, but I think you can never escape the idea that it will, from the get-go, be baked with equity in mind.
Thank you so much. And let's see, last question, I think, let's see. Tazeen Zahida, how important is it for an art organization to be a nonprofit? I would love to know the impact of this on art patrons.
I would say that there is not a one-size-fits-all answer to how should you organize. You know, for different communities, for different artistic emphases, for different desires and end goals for why you want to do the art in the first place, there are different organizational forms. So in terms of how important is it, I think that could be spread across, the importance can be spread across a wide variety of ways of organizing or working independently. You know, the impact on this for arts patrons, you know, I think about the nonprofit form, and I used to teach nonprofit marketing strategy. The ones who care about the nonprofit form the most are the nonprofit organizations, the institutions. You know, typically audience members don't necessarily, they just want to see what they want to see.
Oh, yeah.
Or if it's, you know, artists want to work where there are interesting projects and they feel a sense of security and equity. You know, the form itself, I don't think is the thing that necessarily drives audiences. You know, having that said, I know that there are some who are very, very loyal to particular organizations, but it doesn't mean that it's just because it's a nonprofit organization. And I say that working primarily with the nonprofit art sector. I encourage the diversity of forms.
Thank you so much. Do we have time for one last question? I think we have one more. Okay, I'll try this last one. Julia Brook, what have been the most effective ways to distribute data findings of creative economy surveys across all represented organizations here to leadership and to leadership that has shown to build and develop direct responses or solutions? Do you have any examples across community-led, federally led, and corporate organizations?
one thing I could just jump in, and it may not speak to all that we've discussed today about, our aspirations about even having more equitable sources for data collection. But I think, we are, with the BA data that I mentioned, we also got it down to the state level, but then rather than the NEA just releasing these state reports, we worked with our partner, National Assembly of State Arts Agencies, so that they could create these data dashboards for every state and policy briefs around the degree to which these industries operate in their states, and what is the on the ground kind of the gross state product, not the GDP, as well as employment levels. And that seems to have gone well from what we hear from the state partners, using that data and then distributing it to their own grantees or their own constituencies to maybe then enrich it with their own findings or their own. So one of the things we did is we allowed for this state creative dashboard project to come out of this work we're doing with BA, but then we also asked the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies to continually update a catalog or an inventory of creative economy studies that come out at every state. So they have a great library that's on their website. I can try to share the link if we have time, where they continually update these studies. So I mean, it's just a one-stop place for some of the impact studies we've talked about. Again, not quite getting into yet what we really want to see more of collectively, but a great way of kind of being more transparent and getting various states to recognize what the other state considers a creative economy.
Thank you so much. And I think that's all of the questions that we have. And let's see. Okay. I think
So
that's-
I believe we're at time and maybe a little over. So maybe the final thing is to just thank all of you for the amazing brilliance that you shared today. I hope that the conversation continues to build and grow over the course of not just this summit, but the summits hereafter and in our individual communities as we get to work. So I want to just thank you again for sort of opening up the idea that data and research and evaluation not only can, but should be more equitable and inclusive and decolonized. So thanks everybody. Thank you to West staff. I hope you have a great afternoon.
Thank you, you all.